Hi everybody, Mr. Farmer here, and welcome to AP Macroeconomics. Today we're going to continue our conversation on the Federal Reserve Bank and just the banking system in general. Today's is going to focus on excess reserves. How is a check cleared? We're going to use that to start talking about balance sheets and T-charts. And also, how is money created through this process? Now we're going to start a little warm-up for us to see what's going on. So if a bank has a check of deposits equal to $100,000 and stock shares equal to $100,000, what is the required reserve when the reserve ratio is 1/5, 1/10, and 1/20th? Go and take a moment to think about this. Okay, so something to remember is required reserves are only based on liabilities, and stocks are part of the net worth, the equity, and that's outright owned by the bank. And so those shareholders can't come asking for their money back. That's not how that works. Checkable deposits, though, that is a liability because the owners of that checkable deposit can come and talk about that and ask for it back. So for that reason, if we had a 1/5 or 20% reserve requirement, we'd have to keep $20,000 on hand because it's 20,000 of the 100,000, or 10,000, or 5,000. Now, this is one of the first times we can see a monetary policy in action. The Board of Governors determines the required reserves, and so if they decrease the required reserves from 20% down to 1/20th, well, the bank can lend out more because how much they're required to have on hand is less. So that's one of our first monetary policies, is changing the required reserve for banks. So moving on, we're going to look at the excess reserves, clearing a check, and money creation. So excess reserves, little reminder, excess reserves is how much a bank has in its reserves above the required amount. So the equation I use is the actual reserves, also just reserves or cash on hand, minus the required reserves we've done before. So again, looking at the original walk-in, if the bank has $100,000 in checkable deposits and the reserve ratio is 1/5, what is the excess reserve if the bank has $40,000 in its vault? Notice the checkable deposits are not always equal to the required or the amount of reserves on hand. The bank may have already done something with this. They may have already done a loan, they may have bought property, they may have paid their staff, we don't know. At the end of the day, though, they only have $40,000 left in its vault. So first off, how much is required to have on hand? $100,000, they have to keep 20% of that on hand, they have to keep $20,000. How much do they have? They have an actual reserve of $40,000. We got that from right here. They're supposed to keep the required reserve, $20,000, and so they have an excess reserve of $20,000. And for us, we're going to say, you know what, that's how much they can loan out. And probably they're going to loan out 100% of these excess reserves. That tends to be true for us. We'll talk more about the actuality of that later on, though. So clearing a check. So here you got the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. There are 2, and Boston's 1. So here's a scenario. Someone draws money via check. Okay, you go pay a check, and they bank at Bank X. Here we have Bank X right there. Money gets paid and is transferred to another bank, Bank Y. But there's a little more to it. Bank Y now has a claim against Bank X. Hey, you owe us some money because so-and-so says you owe us money. So this is another one of the things that the Federal Reserve Bank does, is they help with these communication lines. Bank Y will send the check to the Federal Reserve Bank. Now they'll send the one that they're with or they're closest to. Again, it's all one big place, but if they're in New York, they'll go to New York. If they're San Francisco, go to San Francisco, or wherever else it is. So the Federal Reserve will then go ahead and actually change the numbers from Bank X over to Bank Y. Now with computers, this happens very, very quickly. Back in the olden days, it didn't happen so quickly, and so there was some more issues with like check fraud. Now it happens so fast, you don't get that. It's a whole bunch. So let's think about granting a loan. So bank can pull money from its excess reserves. We kind of talked about that earlier. And that's again why those required reserves are so important. So the bank can then increase individuals' checkable deposits and the loan has interest. So that's why banks want to create loans. That's how they make their money. But how do they do that? Well, if we look down here, we have a required reserve of 20%. Okay, just a nice easy number. Checkable deposits of 50,000, which means I have to keep a required reserve of $10,000 on hand. Okay, because again, actual reserves minus required reserves equals the excess reserves. We're going to be using this equation in a second. But how to get those required reserves? 50,000 times the 20%, 1/5. I need to keep $10,000 on hand. So required reserve, $10,000. How much do I actually have in reserve? That's over here on the asset side, because this is in the bank vault. This is owned by the bank. That's what an asset is, and that's why it's important to know what those are. The bank has $60,000 on hand. So what is the excess reserve? $50,000. And they're going to lend that out. So how does this be? Whatever's on the left-hand side must balance on the right-hand side. I'm going to make a loan of $50,000. That's an asset. That's something that's owed to me as the bank. How does it balance on the other side? Well, I create an account. I create a loan for somebody to use, and this can then be spent. But until it's spent, it's just a holding pattern. I just put checkable deposit. You notice a lot of times I'll put from loan just so I can keep track of stuff. You don't have to do that, but I tend to find it's helpful. So again, what just happened? Money was created. The loan accounts for $50,000 in assets that did not previously exist. They used to have $200,000 or $100,000. Now they have $150,000. Okay, so we used to have, again, based on this, we had reserves of $6,000, property $240,000. We had $300,000 worth of stuff, of value of $300,000. But after the loan, we now have $350,000. $50,000 was loaned into existence. It's acceptable. It's legal tender. It has a store of value. It's backed by the fact that there is a loan out against it. So it's backed by something. It's money. What happens if this person actually uses the money? Well, what we're going to talk about next is then this money gets withdrawn. So we're going to subtract out that $50,000. So they're still going to have $50,000 worth of checkable deposits over here. Where does it get taken out over here? I can't take it from the loan. That's not actual money. I have to take it out of the reserves. So I'd subtract $50,000 over here, and I'd be left with $10,000. This $10,000, you remember, was the required reserve. And it's for this reason that banks only lend up to the excess reserve in order to be safe, so that if it all gets withdrawn, they still meet that requirement. So how much new money was made? How does it look when it gets withdrawn? Again, this is what we started with. Okay. Now, this is more what we'll see. We're not going to have the property and the stocks and everything else. We'd simply start out with, you have 20% required reserve, or 10% or 5%. We use very easy, nice numbers just because they're easier to use. You have a checkable deposit of some amount. You have reserves of some amount starting. And you ask, how much could the first loan be for? $40,000. That's it. And again, just really quickly, I'll go through how I got that. Again, I go with whatever the liabilities are times the required reserve. So in this case, that'll be $50,000 from the checkable deposit times my 1/5 required reserve. Means I need to keep $10,000 on hand. I have an actual reserve of $50,000. I need to keep the $10,000 required reserve on hand. So I have an excess reserve, ER, of $40,000. And that's where this loan comes from. Since I made the loan, I need to balance it out by a check or deposit on the other side, because then somebody has to be able to access to this. You can now use this loan. Instead, what if this all got started with a security? So let's assume the Federal Reserve Bank buys a security from a commercial bank. The Fed Bank will purchase those securities with newly printed money by the Fed. Again, they have the jurisdiction to do that, and we're going to assume that's going to be done. Once again, money's been created, literally printed at this point. There's a difference though. This is new money. It's not a liability, so there's no required reserve out against it. Loans from money that are existed, like check or deposits, you do need to keep required reserves because that's a liability. So let's see how this one works. So the bank has a security. Okay, commercial bank, CB, has $50,000. Let's just say they had stock, they sold that, they got a security. Why would they want to do that? There's interest on security, so maybe that's the reason why. But now they want to get rid of this, so they're going to sell the security over to the Fed, Federal Reserve Bank. The Fed is going to go ahead and just print up some money. Again, that's our assumption. And they're going to use this money to give to the bank. So now the Fed has the security and the commercial bank has the cash. They have reserves. Now, the commercial bank can then use these reserves to create the check or deposit, but again, there's no liability out against this. So the end result is the entire $50,000 can be loaned into existence. Because there's no liability, they can loan 100% of that amount on. So how does that look? So we started with assets of a security. Commercial bank's going to sell that to the Fed. So now they're going to have sold the security over to Federal Reserve, and so now this security changes into reserves. Again, that's cash from the Fed. It can now be used for the loan. So this required reserve has nothing to do with this. They'll simply lend 100% of this amount to the first customer that needs it. So how does this compare? Well, let's say we start out with a $50,000 check or deposit and then a $50,000 security sale. How much was lent into existence? Well, with the original check or deposit, they need to keep 20% of that on hand, so they can only lend $40,000 out. So the money supply would have increased by $40,000 since it's now M1 money once it gets used. Because again, that check or deposit, you can use that, it's readily available. How about if it was a security? Well, they can lend out 100% of that, so they can lend $50,000. So the supply money is increased by $50,000 because it's M1, it's readily available to be used with a swipe of a debit card. So securities allow for a larger increase in the money supply. So banks make money through loans and securities, but there can also be run on banks. So how do most make the most of their money? Well, sometimes if they can't quite lend out 100% to their customers of their excess reserves, they might lend to other banks. And the reason why is, well, sometimes banks may lend beyond them, what they actually are able to. Again, the Federal Reserve, according to our McConnell textbook, lends at $150 million per day. That was from 2006. What that means is banks go beyond the required reserves every single day, it seems. And so there's a short-term loan and there's interest on that loan. And so in some cases, banks will lend to other banks, usually at an interest rate that's lower than what the Federal Reserve will lend it for. Okay, more about that later on. There's going to be a thing called the discount rate. So again, what we talk about today are excess reserves. How does clearing a check work? And then we kind of use that to bridge into how is money being created. If it gets created from money that already existed, like a check or deposit, somebody deposits money, versus if it's a security and it's freshly printed money, there's a little bit of a difference. That's going to go into the change in the money supply, which we'll go into next time. Until then,